So to further illustrate the benefits of social consciousness, let's look at things like social conscious funds versus traditional funds. And as a rule, social conscious funds tend to perform certainly on par. At times they can exceed, but at least on par or low, or have a very small lag behind traditional funds. Now, to Milton Friedman's credit, in the years past, again, when we were the only business in town, it didn't matter if you were socially conscious because there was no competition. But now the competition is much more intense, that there truly is a battle, for primacy, in industries. We recognize that there has become a market for businesses that engage in socially conscious behaviors, really, which is really important. So, the next couple of quotes here from Shaheen Pasha and from the Wealthfront blog, both are getting at how these social conscious funds are doing quite well nowadays. I can tell you that my social conscious fund in my TIAA craft does, at pace, on par with the rest of my investments, and on occasion will outpace them. Not always, but on occasion. So it's really nice to see that social consciousness does pay. I can imagine in Friedman's day it didn't pay because there was no competition, so why bother? Why care about those extra things? You don't need to do it. But now in this day and age, it is an imperative. We have to do it. There's no getting around it. And this quote is kind of interesting too, because social conscious funds can outperform their competition over the long term. And here's a quote from Sarah Fine, basically saying, the research team found that sustainable organizations outperform their competitors over the long term in 3 particular sectors where customers are individual consumers. So individuals do speak with their money. They vote with their money. They make it really clear what they like and what they don't like and how they spend their money. The second area, where companies compete on the basis of brands and reputations, so good reputations. If you know that your reputation is going to be hurt by engaging in bad business practices, then you are more conscious about doing things the right way, however you define the right way, in an ethical manner. And in sectors where products significantly depend on extracting large amounts of natural resources. So, in the oil industry, in the steel industry, in mining, and anything along that area, when we know that we're going to have an impact on natural resources, the more conscientious we can be, the more socially conscious we can be around these things, the better off our organization is, and the more high performing those stocks are. As he says here, in these sectors, building a culture of sustainability is probably going to pay off more. So going to the lecture that you'll get in a little bit on sustainability, you can see how when we focus on sustainability in the long haul, this does benefit companies as a means of showing social consciousness. So let me bring you back to this ideal of what we call the standard stakeholder map. And we looked at some variations of them, in a few slides ago. But basically, in both of those, the firm, and the firm's leadership is sort of at the middle. And then, all these other stakeholders are out there. The shareholders are considered a stakeholder, the customers, employees, executives, suppliers, communities, et cetera, et cetera. All these things, and you can see, as a rule, except for, I think, there probably is a mistake on the executives and the shareholders. Clearly there's an interactional effect there. Those arrows should go both ways. But that's the standard stakeholder map, the idea that the firm's in the middle and the rest of the stakeholders are out there. But how about if we change that focus? How about if we think about it in a different way? And that's what we'll see on the next slide. In this slide, what Freeman is arguing is that corporations aren't only ones at the center of the universe, that there could be a whole lot of different ways that we can think about who are the key stakeholders, who are the most important stakeholders to the company. And here's one variation on that the employees can and should be at the middle, that if we ensure that our employees are able to do their job in a safe and harmonious way, this is going to have an impact on customers, on executives, on shareholders, on shareholder value. And I'm sure you can think of companies that make that claim. We talked about Southwest Airlines quite a bit and how employees are truly their most important asset, and they truly believe that if an employee is happy, then and they can do their job well, they have the support to do their job well, this has a positive impact on all of these relationships in the organization. So this could be a great example of the stakeholder map for Southwest Airlines. Not every company shares that, but the goal of what I'm trying to say here is, and what Freeman's trying to say is, stakeholders are going to vary in importance, and it really depends on the context. It depends on the context of, who has the most at stake, and how are we arranged and organized in such a way that, for the purpose of our business, where are we going to have our biggest problem if we have a leakage or a breakage in the way that we do our business and the flow of work. And so none of these maps should be written in stone that there's only one way to think about the relationships and these complex relationships that we're engaged in. And how we set those priorities is going to differ depending on the lens that we use. So this complex stakeholder map gives you a good idea of the intensity of the relationships that we engage in. And for us to only look at shareholders, and that would be basically in that inner ring on the left-hand side, to the left of where it says the firm, you see Class A stockholders, Class B stockholders, bondholders, and banks. Right? These are the people that helped us with financing, right? And if those are the only ones we care about, look at the wide variety of other groups that we're ignoring, that our actions are going to have perhaps a negative impact on. And so I think this illustration really argues that you can't just focus on one group. That's not to say that they don't have the most at risk, and they probably do. But there are so many others that are impacted by your behaviors that it's essential that you make sure you're thinking about all of them in the totality of the factors to consider when you're making your decision. And given our initial lectures on the complexity of making these kinds of decisions, you can understand that this is not an easy task, right? Our brains are very limited in the way that we can make these decisions. And so it is a challenge to think about it. But if we approach it from a positive point of view, as opposed to an adversarial point of view, you gain more benefits because you're relieving some of the stressors that happen in your head when you're making it more adversarial. And it makes it a lot easier to make these relationships work. In the end, I think both Friedman and Freeman would agree that it's really not technically a debate, particularly if you start thinking about externalities and you account for externalities and you account for the fact that when stakeholders have value, everybody wins. It is a win-win. And the quote here I really appreciate, so I'm just going to rehash it here. The primary responsibility of an executive is to create as much value as possible for stakeholders, because that is how you create as much value for shareholders. When you screw over your stakeholders, as I'm editorializing here, when you screw over your stakeholders, they're going to come back to bite you. We know this. This is sort of natural human tendencies. People seek revenge. So you can't continue to screw somebody over and not expect it eventually to hurt you. So if your goal is to keep it adversarial, just to extract what you can in the short haul, in the long haul, you're not acting in a sustainable and fair way for the organization. So going back to the quote, where there is a conflict between stakeholders and shareholders, executives have to rethink the problem so that the interests all go together. In essence, what he's arguing for is a win-win agreement. And so as you get into your next class, in the negotiations class with Dr. Love, as many of you will be moving on to, that's the way to think about things, that it's about all the stakeholders. It's not just about what the shareholders want, and it's not a zero-sum game. It's not a win-lose. No stakeholder interest stands alone. Where interests conflict, the job of the manager is to figure out how to redefine things so to create more value for both without resorting to trade-offs or fraud or deception, which is that harken back to the quote from Milton Friedman. The goal, Friedman would argue, we're only worried about profit. And Freeman says, yes, we worry about profit, but we do it not by screwing over all of our stakeholders and only focusing on shareholders. We do it by making sure all the stakeholders' interests are met, and we do it to find value for everybody, to make it a win-win, and we don't do it by making trade-offs that are going to hurt ourselves and others. Because again, as Friedman says, we want to make sure both people are in an agreement and in an arrangement that actually matters, that everybody gets something out of it. So we don't engage in fraud, we don't engage in deception, we don't do things illegally or unethically, we do things fairly and freely and above board. And in the end, we can all win. One of the things that people have to get used to, managers in particular, is to use moral language as they make discussions. And what I mean by moral language is truly thinking about the ethical implications of what they do in pretty much every decision that they make. Managers always think about things in terms of financials or in terms of strategy, but they tend to ignore the moral dimensions. Even if they see them, they recognize them, they're honoring them, but they don't use the words. They don't say them out loud. And if you don't say those words out loud, if you don't say, what's the right thing to do? What's the ethical thing to do? If, you'll find that people will start to not use those words anymore. And instead of exercising sort of our moral muscle, it'll tend to atrophy. So it's important for us as we analyze things and we use the language of business, we use the language of financials, we use the language of strategy, that we also need to use the language of ethics. All right? So the goal here is, even if we are behaving morally, we should also talk about it and not just let it be assumed. Let's talk about the pink elephant in the room, if you will. Acknowledge that ethical issues and ethical considerations are a huge part of this. And that's how you start to develop your ethical culture. That's how it becomes stronger and more ingrained, when it becomes part of the language and the symbols and the things that we use, as we talked about culture a while ago. So this slide is a nice comparison of this idea of stakeholder theory versus business and shareholder primacy. And the way this is set up is it's saying, if something is considered good for ethics and it's considered bad for business, that is the traditional view of, say, corporate social responsibility. The traditional view, particularly under Milton Friedman, is that it might be good ethically to do something, but it's not always good for business if we engage in corporate social responsibility. And again, if the assumption is that corporate social responsibility is only about giving, altruistically, you can absolutely see that that's not a good decision. But when you're giving in a way that's more strategic, as we'll address in a bit, that actually is much better for business. But the old traditional view, if you will, of corporate social responsibility says, this is all about giving and we're supposed to give and give and give. Yeah, that could be considered as bad for business, absolutely. Something that's bad ethically and bad for business, well, those are nihilists, and I think we can probably just sort of, wink, wink, nod, nod, and ignore them. But let's go over to that bottom left there in that 2x2. Friedman's interpretations tend to be argued that, if you're going to do something, it better be good for business, and it is not always going to be ethical. Because his argument is we shouldn't engage in CSR. We don't need to behave, necessarily, engage in sort of this detailed ethical analysis. The focus should be on, profits and profits for shareholders, and nothing else matters. Problem is, if we're only limited to that view, we might engage in things that are illegal, and that could put us into a lot of danger. So Friedman-esque interpretations, not necessarily Friedman's views, but Friedman-esque interpretations would be, if it's good for business, it typically is not always a good ethical thing to do, necessarily. The bottom line here with stakeholder theory is that it's good for business and it should be good for ethics. It's a win-win across the board. When we pay attention to all of our stakeholders, that's good for us ethically also. And we win for business and we win for treating people fairly and appropriately. I like this idea of enlightened value maximization. And the idea of enlightened value maximization is that we need to be thinking about things really in terms of long-term implications. Going back to the point, previously about Friedman's focus has tended to be much more on the short term than the long term. And the problem is, if we only focus on the short term, we give people license to engage in unethical and sometimes illegal behaviors, because we tell them no matter what, you need to make money, and all that matters is what we do right now in this moment, in this quarter, and we forget about the impact that we have on long-term profitability and long-term reputational issues and things like that. So enlightened value maximization is really about thinking about the long term and making sure that we don't destroy our reputation in the process. So when we think about, stockholders more important than stakeholders, and how do we handle this situation? A lot of times it comes down to metrics. And the metrics are the ways that we utilize tools to know whether or not we had an impact, that something mattered. So metrics are a key part of how we understand our value, and your metrics can't just be limited to financial ones. We have to be thinking about broadly about what metrics are essential to us. And financials are important, yes. We saw the stuff about the social conscience funds, and those metrics are really important. But there's other issues too, the things that we can't put a dollar value on, which is our reputation. And it's really hard to put a dollar value on your reputation. It's hard to put a dollar value on a human life. We know what the actuarial tables would tell us, but clearly, telling somebody that you're only worth a couple of dollars, doesn't really flow too easily. So our goal in this whole idea for the keeping score is we need to ensure that we have useful metrics that we're using that are really related to what matters and what our purpose is in engaging on the behaviors that we're engaging in. Stakeholder value is important in that aspect. So we were addressing earlier about this issue of trade-offs, and do we sometimes have to make trade-offs? Yeah, sometimes we do. The goal is we always want it to be a win-win solution. We always want to try to find that. But as you'll know, as I'm sure you know, and as you will sort of explore even more, win-wins are not always the best solution and are not always feasible. When it's feasible, aim for it. When it's not feasible, clearly we have to think about trade-offs. And there are times when you're going to have to do that. The goal here is that we don't want to screw over any one particular stakeholder than another. So they don't want to get one group to get the short end of the stick all the time. So I'd say, oh, well, shareholders win, environment loses every single time. That's going to create a problem because, again, because these are embedded relationships, when we start to create a tension in those embedded relationships, that's when that complex web of trust starts to fade and starts to break down. So I would argue that the best companies really do think about what the impact is in the stakeholders, that we're honest with them when we have to make a decision that may not benefit them the best, try to give them the best reasoning that we have, and then try our best not to hurt them in the future, that we will make sure that we're considering their issues in other contexts when we can and when it's appropriate. So what are some typical misinterpretations around this idea of stakeholder theory? Number one, the idea that stakeholder theory is only concerned about distributing our financial outputs, and therefore it has to be distributed equally amongst everybody. And then no, that's not necessarily true. It's not just about who gets how much, but about who has a voice, who can be heard. I mean, even if someone doesn't get a benefit, if they feel heard, there's a benefit in that. And so it's about making sure it's a fair process and that we have voice and concern for everybody involved. And when people's voices are heard, as I've said before, this is a win-win for everybody. I appreciate when I'm heard even if I don't get what I want. If I really truly believe that someone heard me and considered what I had to say, again, that feels good for me. So stakeholder isn't just about the financial stuff, but it's also about the trust in the relationships and the way we manage that. The next one, are all stakeholders should be treated equally? Well, no, not at all. I mean, as I've said multiple times before, there are different risks for different stakeholders, different costs for different stakeholders, different contributions for different stakeholders. But we have to make sure we're accurately representing what those risks and costs and contributions are. You might say, well, it's the environment, so who cares? Well, there's a cost to that, not maybe in the short term, but clearly in the long term. And so we have to be considering all of those issues. The goal here is that when we think about the ranking and the importance of different stakeholders, that they're ranked based on what their contributions, costs, and risks are. And when we do that, it makes it an enormous amount easier for us to then consider what their issues and concerns are. And it also, how we rank and treat those stakeholders is really dependent on what our lens is. People with a rights and responsibility lens are much more focused on the individual and that individual's duties, and did they behave those duties appropriately. Alternatively, someone who's a reputation lens is much more concerned about behaving virtuously, or the relationship lens is concerned more about the community and ensuring that the community is treated fairly in that process. Another interpretation is the idea that stakeholder theory is socialism, and we've already had this discussion, right? Stakeholder theory is about building trusts and building trust within a free market economy. It's not about managing your economy through government regulations and government control. Stakeholder theory is not a form of socialism where you're giving away the farm. Stakeholder theory is about making sure that we build good, trusting relationships with others. The other thing is that stakeholder theory is about corporate social responsibility. Yes, it is at some level, but really what it's about is creating value for everybody in a very strong social structure, and it makes us recognize that when we have good social value, that also can affect our financial bottom line. And as we can see from those social conscience funds, they can have a very positive impact on our financial bottom line. So good behaviors affect our reputation. Our reputation then encourages our suppliers and our buyers and our customers and our employees to behave well and to do business with us. And so it's embedded. There's a very complex web of relationships. You can't just assume if you screw people over all the time that you're going to end up, ahead winning. It's not going to work that way.